What happens when a captive risks her life to protect the child of her captor during a violent raid? In the rugged mountains of Northern California, one woman's instinctive act of courage shatters every assumption about loyalty and changes the fate of everyone involved. The summer of 1873 brought drought to the coastal mountains of Northern California, where the Cahto people had lived for countless generations. The redwood forests that towered above their village provided shelter and sustenance, but the encroaching white settlements had pushed deeper into their territory with each passing year. Streams that once ran clear and full now trickled weakly between sun-baked stones, and the game that sustained the tribe had grown scarce as hunters from the mining camps took more than their share. Lone Wolf stood at the highest point of the village, his dark eyes scanning the valley below where smoke from distant homesteads marked the ever-growing presence of outsiders. Each new column of smoke represented another piece of Cahto, land claimed by those who saw the forest only as timber to be harvested and the rich earth as something to be torn apart in search of gold. His jaw tightened as he counted 7 new smoke plumes that had not existed when the season began. He was a man of 30 summers, broad-shouldered and commanding, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders and a face marked by the trials of leadership. 3 pale scars ran across his left shoulder, souvenirs from a grizzly bear encounter when he was barely 16. As war chief of his band, Lone Wolf carried the weight of protecting his people during these uncertain times, making decisions that could mean the difference between survival and destruction. But his greatest burden was not the threat of soldiers or settlers, or the diminishing resources that kept him awake at night. It was the small figure that sat beside him now, her unseeing eyes turned toward the warmth of the afternoon sun. Little Fawn was 8 years old, and for the past 6 months, she had lived in darkness. The fever that swept through the village during the winter had taken 3 elders and left his daughter blind. Lone Wolf remembered those terrible days with clarity that still made his chest ache. He had held Little Fawn as her small body burned with heat, had listened to her delirious cries, and had felt utterly powerless as the sickness ran its course. When she finally woke, weak but alive, he had wept with relief until she reached for his face, and he realized her eyes no longer tracked movement or light. The Cahto medicine woman had tried every remedy known to their people. She had made poultices from sacred herbs, performed healing ceremonies that lasted 3 days and nights, and called upon the spirits to restore the child's sight. But the darkness remained, absolute and unchanging. Lone Wolf watched his daughter's face as she tilted her head, listening to the sounds of the forest with an intensity that broke his heart. "Father, the jays are quarreling near the oak tree," she said softly, her small hand reaching out to find his arm with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to navigate a world without sight. Lone Wolf covered her hand with his own, marveling at how her other senses had sharpened since losing her vision. Her hearing had become so acute that she could identify individuals by the sound of their footsteps, could tell the difference between a dozen different bird calls, and could sense changes in weather before anyone else in the village. "Your ears hear what others miss, Little Fawn. This is a gift," he said, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. He would trade every gift, every skill she had developed, for the return of her vision. "The hunters will return soon," she continued, her head turning slightly toward the southern trail that wound through the redwoods. "I hear their footsteps on the far trail, and they carry heavy loads. The hunt was successful. I think they brought down an elk, Father. I can hear the pride in how they walk." Lone Wolf listened, hearing nothing but the whisper of wind through the great trees, and felt again that mixture of pride and sorrow that had become so familiar. His daughter possessed gifts that others did not, but he would give anything to have her simply be an ordinary child who could run and play without fear of stumbling, who could see the beauty of sunset painting the sky, who could meet his eyes when he spoke to her. Before he could respond, shouts erupted from the village below. He stood quickly, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. 2 young warriors were running up the path, and between them stumbled a woman in a torn gray dress, her auburn hair falling loose from what had once been a careful braid. Her hands were bound with rawhide, and dirt streaked her pale face. Blood seeped from a cut on her forehead where she had apparently fallen or been struck. "Warchief," called the warrior named Swift Otter as they approached, breathing hard from the steep climb. "We found this white woman near the southern creek, the one that feeds into the valley. She was gathering plants and carrying strange implements. She claims to be alone, but we suspect others may be nearby." Lone Wolf's eyes narrowed as he studied the captive. Swift Otter was young but cautious, not given to unnecessary alarm. If he suspected a trap, there was reason for concern. The warchief moved Little Fawn gently behind him, positioning himself between his daughter and the potential threat. The white woman stumbled as Swift Otter pushed her forward, nearly falling to her knees. But she caught herself and stood straight despite her obvious exhaustion and fear. She was young, perhaps 25 summers, with green eyes that held terror but also a defiant spark Lone Wolf had not expected. Most white women collapsed in hysterical terror when captured by the Cahto, screaming and begging for mercy. This one stood as tall as her bound hands and battered condition would allow, her jaw set with determination, even as he could see her legs trembling. "What is your name?" Lone Wolf demanded in English, a language he had learned from traders and missionaries who occasionally passed through the territory. His accent was thick but his words clear. "Julia Mackenzie," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her hands, and the way her chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. "I'm a midwife and healer. I was gathering medicinal plants near the creek. I mean no harm to your people. I didn't know I had crossed into your territory. I'm truly sorry for the trespass." Swift Otter spat on the ground, his young face twisted with suspicion and anger. "She lies, Warchief. White women do not travel alone in these mountains. Everyone knows the dangers. She is a spy for the settlers, sent to locate our village so the miners can drive us out. Or perhaps she is bait to draw us into a trap. Even now, soldiers may be moving into position." The other warrior, a seasoned fighter named Gray Fox, nodded his agreement. "Swift Otter speaks wisdom. I have lived through 30 winters and never once seen a white woman venture this far into the mountains alone. It is unnatural. We should question her harshly to learn the truth of her mission." Lone Wolf considered this possibility carefully. The warriors were right to be suspicious. White settlers had used many tricks to locate Cahto camps in recent years. A lone woman would be an effective lure, something to draw warriors out while soldiers moved into position. Just last spring, a neighboring band had been nearly wiped out by such a trap. Yet something about this woman's direct gaze and the exhaustion evident in every line of her body suggested she spoke truth. "Show me what you gathered," he commanded, gesturing to the leather satchel that Gray Fox held. Swift Otter emptied the worn leather bag onto the ground with more force than necessary. Bundles of yarrow, willow bark, sage, and other medicinal plants tumbled out, along with small glass bottles stoppered with cork. Clean cloth bandages rolled with careful precision, and metal instruments Lone Wolf recognized as surgical tools. He had seen such implements before, carried by the army doctor who had come to treat wounded soldiers at the fort 20 miles to the east. These were the supplies of a genuine healer, not a spy. Julia Mackenzie watched anxiously as Lone Wolf examined her possessions, her green eyes tracking his movements. "The yarrow is for stopping bleeding," she said quickly, her words tumbling out in her urgency to prove her claims. "The willow bark for pain and fever. The sage for infections and wounds that won't heal properly. I was gathering them for patients in the mining settlement. There's a woman there about to give birth, and I fear complications. She needs these medicines." Before Lone Wolf could speak further, Little Fawn suddenly stood and moved forward with the careful steps of someone navigating by memory and sound. Her small feet found the path unerringly, avoiding the rocks and roots that dotted the ground. "Father, let me touch her," the child said, her voice carrying that peculiar certainty she had developed since losing her sight. "Little Fawn, return to my side," Lone Wolf commanded, concern sharpening his tone. He trusted his daughter's instincts, but he could not risk her safety near a stranger who might yet prove dangerous. But his daughter continued forward, her small hands outstretched. Fingers spread to sense the air before her. "Please, Father. I need to know if she speaks truth. Let me touch her." Julia Mackenzie's eyes widened as she watched the blind child approach, and something fundamental shifted in her expression. The fear receded, replaced by a deep compassion that transformed her face. Without being asked, without hesitation, she dropped to her knees to bring herself to the girl's level, making it easier for Little Fawn to reach her. The movement was so natural, so instinctive, that it spoke of someone accustomed to caring for children. Swift Otter moved forward, his hand on his knife. "Warchief, this is unwise." The white woman could harm Little Fawn, but Lone Wolf raised his hand, watching intently as his daughter's small fingers found Julia's face. Little Fawn's hands moved with delicate precision, tracing the woman's features with the gentle exploration of one who must see through touch. Her fingertips traced Julia's forehead, careful around the bleeding cut, then moved down to trace cheekbones, nose, lips, and chin. Julia remained perfectly still, tears suddenly glistening in her eyes as she understood what she was witnessing. Little Fawn's hands moved to Julia's shoulders, then down to her arms, finally coming to rest on the woman's bound hands. The child's fingers explored the calluses on Julia's palms, the shape of her fingers, the way her hands were formed. For a long moment, there was complete silence except for the whisper of wind through the redwoods and the distant call of a hawk. "Her hands are healing hands," Little Fawn said with absolute certainty, her voice ringing clear in the afternoon air. "They are gentle and careful, like Grandmother Willow's hands before she passed to the spirit world. This woman helps people, Father. She has delivered babies and tended the sick. I can feel the truth of it in how her hands are shaped, in the way her heart beats steady and strong. She does not lie." Lone Wolf felt his chest tighten at his daughter's words. Since losing her sight, Little Fawn had developed an uncanny ability to sense truth and emotion in others. She claimed she could feel the rhythm of people's hearts through their skin, could hear the honesty or deception in their voices through subtle changes in tone and breath. The medicine woman said the spirits had given her this gift to replace her lost vision, that Little Fawn now saw with her heart instead of her eyes. Julia Mackenzie looked up at Lone Wolf, and he saw that tears now rolled down her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dirt that smudged her face. "Your daughter," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "How long has she been blind? Was it sudden or gradual? Does she experience any pain in her eyes?" "That is not your concern," Lone Wolf replied, his tone harder than he felt. He could not afford to show weakness before his warriors, even as his heart ached at the reminder of his daughter's condition. A warchief must be strong, must show no vulnerability that enemies could exploit. "6 moons, Little Fawn answered before her father could stop her, turning her face toward the sound of Julia's voice. "The fever came in the deep winter. It burned through me like fire, and when it finally released me, my eyes no longer saw light or darkness or anything at all. My father says I am blessed to be alive, but I know he would trade anything to give me back my sight. I hear it in his voice when he thinks I sleep, when he prays to the spirits in the dark hours of night." Julia's expression transformed from fear and relief at her own situation to something else entirely. Professional interest mixed with deep compassion as she studied Little Fawn's face with the practiced eye of a trained healer. "May I examine her eyes?" she asked Lone Wolf, her voice urgent now. "Please. I've studied under doctors in San Francisco. brilliant physicians who taught me techniques from all over the world. I've seen cases where vision loss from fever isn't permanent. Sometimes the eyes themselves are undamaged, but swelling or scarring blocks the pathways that carry sight to the mind. With the right treatment, with specific medicines and careful attention, there's a genuine possibility of improvement. I cannot promise restoration of full sight, but even partial vision would change her life. Swift Otter laughed harshly, his young face twisted with contempt. White medicine is poison. Everyone knows this. The woman seeks to harm the war chief's daughter to weaken our people. This is an old trick. She will blind the child further, or perhaps kill her, and then the settlers will claim it was an accident while they move to take more of our land. We should send her away or silence her permanently. Gray Fox nodded slowly, though his expression was more thoughtful than Swift Otter's anger. The young one speaks from emotion, but his concern has merit. White doctors have not helped our people. When the spotted sickness came 15 winters ago, their medicine made many worse. My own brother died after taking their treatments. But Lone Wolf saw the genuine concern in Julia Mackenzie's face. Noticed how her eyes kept returning to Little Fawn with a mixture of professional assessment and personal compassion. He heard the echo of his daughter's words about healing hands and remembered his wife's belief that help could come from unexpected sources. You will have opportunity to prove your claims, he said slowly. Each word weighted with the gravity of his decision. But know this, Julia Mackenzie. If you bring any harm to my daughter, if her condition worsens under your care, if I suspect for even a moment that you have deceived us, your death will be slow and painful. I will ensure you live long enough to regret every choice that brought you to this moment. Do you understand? Julia nodded, meeting his gaze directly despite the fear that must be coursing through her. I understand completely. All I ask is the chance to help her. I swear on my own life, on everything I hold sacred, that I will do everything in my power to help your daughter. Children should not suffer when there is knowledge and skill that might ease their pain. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, Lone Wolf made his decision. Take her to the empty lodge near the eastern edge of the village, he commanded Swift Otter and Gray Fox. Post guards at all times. She is not to be harmed, but neither is she to be allowed freedom to move through the camp. Tomorrow, when the light is good, we will see if her words match her actions. If she can help Little Fawn, she will be rewarded. If she cannot, or if she has deceived us, she will face the consequences that evening. As the village settled into its nightly routines with families gathering around cooking fires and children playing their last games before darkness fell completely, Lone Wolf sat with Little Fawn outside their dwelling. His daughter leaned against his side, her small body warm and trusting in a way that never failed to move him. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant points of light in the deepening blue of the sky. You believe the white woman can help me see again? Little Fawn asked quietly, her fingers playing with the fringe on her father's buckskin shirt. Lone Wolf wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I do not know, Little Fawn. The medicine woman has tried everything our people know, and the darkness remains. But your mother, before the sickness took her from us 3 winters ago, taught me that healing can come from unexpected places. She said the spirits sometimes send help in forms we do not recognize, wearing faces we might turn away if we judge only by appearance. If there is even the smallest chance this white woman speaks truth, if there is any possibility she possesses knowledge that can help you, I must allow her to try. To refuse would be to let my pride harm my daughter, and that I will not do. I am not afraid of the darkness anymore, Little Fawn said, her voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years that always surprised him. At first, when I woke and could not see, I was terrified. Everything was gone, all the colors and faces and beauty of the world. But slowly, I learned that there is another way of seeing. I hear the love in your voice, Father. I feel the warmth of the sun and the coolness of the evening. I sense the truth in people's hearts. But, her voice grew softer, more vulnerable. I miss seeing your face. I miss watching the sunset paint the sky. I miss seeing the flowers bloom in spring and the way snow makes everything clean and new. If the white woman can bring back even a little light, even just shadows and shapes, I would be so grateful. Lone Wolf pressed his lips to the top of his daughter's head. His eyes stinging with emotion, he could not show his warriors. A war chief must be strong, but here, alone with his child, he could acknowledge the fear and desperate hope that lived in his heart. Then we will give her the chance, he whispered. We will see what tomorrow brings. In the guarded lodge at the village's edge, Julia Mackenzie sat on a woven mat, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. Her wrists ached where the rawhide bonds had been finely cut, and the cut on her forehead throbbed with each heartbeat. She had traveled to California 3 years ago after her husband died of pneumonia in their Boston home. Thomas had been a good man, a kind physician who had taught her much of what she knew. Unable to bear the memories that haunted every corner of their home and the pitying glances of neighbors who whispered about the young widow, she had answered an advertisement for a midwife in the mining towns of Northern California. The work had been hard and often dangerous, delivering babies in rough cabins with inadequate supplies, treating injuries that would have challenged even the finest hospital doctors, dealing with diseases spread by poor sanitation and overcrowding. But it had given her purpose and helped her heal from her grief. Each life she saved, each mother who survived childbirth, each fever she broke with her medicines, was a small victory against the death that had taken so much from her. She had learned much from the local healers, both white and native, combining their knowledge with her formal medical training. An old Chinese herbalist in one of the mining camps had taught her the uses of plants Western doctors ignored. A Mexican curandera had shown her techniques for setting bones that surpassed anything she had learned in Boston. And now, captured by the Cahto, she had an opportunity to help a blind child whose father's desperate love reminded her painfully of Thomas and the children they had never had the chance to raise. The memory of little Fawn's sightless eyes haunted her. Julia had seen similar cases during her training in San Francisco, where a brilliant physician named Dr. Chun had taught her techniques combining Eastern and Western medicine. If the blindness had been caused by fever-related inflammation rather than permanent damage to the eyes themselves, there was genuine hope for improvement. The key would be reducing inflammation around the optic nerves while stimulating blood flow to the eyes. It would take time, careful treatment, and medicine she would need to prepare from the plants in her bag and whatever local resources were available. As moonlight filtered through the gaps in the lodge walls, casting silver patterns on the packed earth floor, Julia heard soft footsteps approaching. The door covering lifted and an elderly Cahto woman entered, carrying a wooden bowl filled with venison stew and a cup of water. She set them down without speaking, her weathered face unreadable in the dim light. "Thank you," Julia said in English, then tried the few Cahto words she had learned from a friendly native trader months ago who had taught her basic phrases. "I am grateful for your kindness." The old woman's eyes widened slightly at hearing her language spoken by a white woman, however poorly. She studied Julia for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to look past the surface to something deeper. Finally she spoke in halting English, her accent thick but understandable. "You are healer?" "True healer, or white woman who pretends." Julia nodded eagerly, sensing this was an important moment. "Yes, I'm a midwife and I've trained with doctors in San Francisco and Boston. I've delivered over 100 babies, treated fevers and injuries and diseases. I truly want to help the little girl if I can. I've seen cases like hers before. There is hope," the medicine woman. The morning sun filtered through the redwood canopy, casting dappled shadows across the Cahto village as it stirred to life. Julia Mackenzie had barely slept, her mind occupied with plans for treating little Fawn's blindness and the precarious position she found herself in. Every sound outside her guarded lodge made her pulse quicken. Wondering if this would be the moment Lone Wolf changed his mind about allowing her to help his daughter. She was examining the contents of her medical bag for the third time, mentally cataloging what she had and what she would need, when the door covering was pushed aside. Lone Wolf stood in the entrance, his imposing figure blocking most of the morning light. Behind him, Little Fawn held his hand, her free hand trailing along the doorframe to orient herself. "You will examine my daughter now," Lone Wolf said, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "The medicine woman will watch everything you do. If she senses deception or danger, this ends immediately." Julia stood quickly, brushing dirt from her torn dress. "I understand. May I have more light? I need to see her eyes clearly." Lone Wolf led them to a clearing near the center of the village where morning sunlight fell unobstructed. Curious villagers began to gather at a respectful distance, their faces showing mixtures of hope, suspicion, and curiosity. Julia felt the weight of their stares, but forced herself to focus entirely on Little Fawn. "Hello, Little Fawn," Julia said softly, kneeling before the child. "I'm going to look at your eyes very carefully now. It won't hurt, but I need you to be very still and follow my instructions. Can you do that?" Little Fawn nodded solemnly, her unseeing eyes fixed somewhere past Julia's left shoulder. "I can be still. Will you really be able to make me see again?" Julia chose her words carefully, aware that Lone Wolf and the entire village were listening. "I cannot make promises about things I'm not certain of yet. But I will tell you what I find, and I will do everything I know how to do to help you. That much I can promise." She gently tilted Little Fawn's face toward the sunlight, using her thumbs to carefully open the child's eyelids wider. The eyes themselves appeared physically intact, the irises a deep brown, the whites clear without signs of infection. Julia pulled a small magnifying glass from her bag and examined each eye methodically, looking for scarring, cloudiness, or damage to the pupils. "Her pupils are responding slightly to light changes," Julia murmured, more to herself than to the watching crowd. "That's an excellent sign. Little Fawn, I'm going to hold my hand at different distances from your face. Tell me if you can sense anything, any shadow or darkness moving." Julia moved her hand slowly from far away to close to Little Fawn's face, watching the child's expression intently. When her hand was about 6 inches from Little Fawn's eyes, the child suddenly said, "Something is there." Not clear, but darker than before. Excitement surged through Julia, but she kept her voice calm. "Very good. Now I'm going to touch different parts of your face. And I want you to tell me if you can sense my hand approaching before I actually touch you, for the next 20 minutes. Julia conducted a thorough examination while Lone Wolf watched with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how much rested on her assessment. Finally, she sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The fever caused severe inflammation around the optic nerves, Julia explained, speaking slowly so everyone could understand. Think of it like a swollen river blocking a path. The path itself isn't destroyed, but nothing can get through until the swelling goes down. Her eyes can detect some light and shadow, which means the damage isn't complete. With the right treatment, reducing inflammation and improving blood flow to the eyes, there's a real possibility of restoring at least partial vision. Maybe more, but I won't know until we try. The medicine woman, who had been watching silently, spoke in Cahto to Lone Wolf. They conversed rapidly, the old woman's gestures indicating she was explaining something important. Finally, Lone Wolf turned back to Julia. "Grandmother Willow says your words match what the spirits showed her in a dream 3 nights ago. She saw a woman with hair like fire who would bring light from darkness. She did not know if this woman would be friend or enemy, helper or destroyer. This is why you will prepare your medicines under her watchful eye, and why I will watch every treatment you give my daughter." Julia nodded her acceptance of these terms. "I'll need several plants that grow in this region. Some I have in my bag, but others I'll need to gather fresh. I'll also need clean water, a way to heat it, and clay or wooden bowls for mixing. Swift Otter and Gray Fox will accompany you to gather what you need, Lone Wolf decided. You will not leave their sight. For the next several hours, Julia worked under the suspicious watch of her guards and the curious eyes of the medicine woman. She gathered fresh willow bark from trees near the stream, explaining how it reduced inflammation. She found wild ginger root, which would improve blood circulation. She collected eyebright, a small flowering plant she had learned about from a British herbalist, known for treating eye conditions, back in the village. She carefully prepared her medicines, grinding, mixing, and brewing under Grandmother Willow's watchful gaze. The old woman occasionally nodded approval or suggested a local plant that might enhance the mixture. Despite the language barrier and the circumstances, Julia felt a growing respect for the medicine woman's knowledge. This must be applied to her eyes 3 times daily, Julia explained to Lone Wolf as she prepared the first treatment. A greenish paste made from her carefully blended herbs. It will feel cool and may tingle slightly, but it should not cause pain.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
If she experiences sharp pain, burning, or increased discomfort, you must tell me immediately and we'll stop. Little Fawn sat patiently as Julia applied the medicine. Her small face turned trustingly toward the sounds of Julia's voice. It feels strange, the child said. Like mint leaves, but on my eyes instead of in tea. Julia smiled despite her nervousness. That's the eyebright herb. It's helping reduce the swelling that's blocking your sight. Now I'm going to wrap a soft cloth around your eyes to keep the medicine in place. You'll need to keep it on until this evening. Then we'll remove it and see if there's any change. As Julia worked, she was acutely aware of Lone Wolf's presence just behind her, close enough that she could hear his breathing, feel the tension radiating from him. This child was everything to him, and Julia held his hopes in her inexperienced hands. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. There, she said finally, securing the bandage. Now you must rest, little fawn. Healing happens best when the body is calm and still. Lone Wolf helped his daughter stand, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. You will stay in the lodge next to ours, he told Julia. Grandmother Willow will watch you. Tomorrow morning, we see if your white medicine brings results or empty promises. That afternoon, while little Fawn rested and the village went about its daily work, Julia sat outside her assigned lodge, sorting through her remaining supplies. She was crushing dried herbs with a smooth river stone when shouts suddenly erupted from the village perimeter. Warriors ran past her lodge, grabbing weapons as they moved. Julia stood, her heart racing, trying to understand what was happening. The medicine woman appeared at her side, her weathered face grim. Bandits come, Grandmother Willow said in broken English. Bad white men who steal and kill. They have found village. Julia's blood ran cold. Bandits were common in these mountains, lawless men who preyed on mining camps and isolated homesteads. But if they were bold enough to attack a Cahto village, they must be numerous and well-armed. She thought of little Fawn, blind and helpless, unable to run or hide effectively. Without thinking, Julia ran toward Lone Wolf's lodge. She found little Fawn sitting alone inside, her head tilted in that listening posture Julia had come to recognize, the bandages still wrapped around her eyes. Little Fawn, where is your father? Julia asked urgently. He went to lead the warriors, the child replied, fear creeping into her voice for the first time since Julia had met her. There are many bad men coming. I can hear their horses and their angry voices. They are close, very close. Julia's mind raced. The lodge was too exposed, too obvious a target if the bandits broke through the warriors' defense. She needed to get little Fawn somewhere safer. Can you walk quickly if I guide you? She asked, before little Fawn could answer. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, followed by war cries and the screams of frightened villagers. The attack had begun. Julia grabbed little Fawn's hand and pulled her toward the back of the lodge, where the forest pressed close. "We need to hide you somewhere the bad men won't find you," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite her racing heart. They had barely exited the lodge when Julia heard boots pounding nearby and rough male voices speaking, English with cruel laughter woven through their words. 3 bandits crashed through the brush, their guns drawn, their faces flushed with violence and whiskey. "Well, what do we have here?" The largest one said, his yellowed teeth showing in a predatory grin. "A white woman and a little Indian. This is our lucky day, boys." Julia positioned herself between the bandits and little Fawn, her arms spread wide. "Leave the child alone," she said firmly, though terror threatened to choke her words. "She's blind and helpless. There's no profit in harming her." The bandit leader laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Maybe we'll take both of you then. White woman will fetch a good price in the right market. And even a blind Indian kid can be sold for labor." He stepped forward. Reaching for Julia, she slapped his hand away with a strength born of desperation. "You'll have to kill me first," she said. "That can be arranged," the bandit growled. Raising his pistol, in that moment, time seemed to slow. Julia heard little Fawn's frightened whimper behind her, felt the child's small hands clutching at her torn dress. She saw the bandit's finger tightening on the trigger. She thought of Thomas, of all the patients she had saved, of the strange path that had led her to this moment, where she would die protecting the child of a man who had captured her just yesterday. Then an arrow whistled through the air with a sound like a striking snake. It buried itself in the bandit leader's shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. He screamed, dropping his pistol. His companions turned to see Lone Wolf emerging from the trees, his bow already knocked with another arrow, his face transformed into a mask of deadly rage. But Lone Wolf wasn't looking at the bandits. His eyes were locked on Julia, on the way she stood with her arms spread protectively over his daughter, on her torn dress and bleeding hands where she had grabbed thorny branches trying to shield little Fawn. For a frozen moment, their eyes met across the small clearing. Then Lone Wolf's bow clattered to the ground. The other bandits raised their guns, but before they could fire, Swift Otter and Gray Fox burst from the opposite side of the clearing with 3 more warriors. The brief, brutal fight that followed ended with 2 bandits dead and the wounded leader fleeing into the forest. Swift Otter started to pursue, but Lone Wolf stopped him with a raised hand. "Let him go," the Warchief said, his voice strange and tight. "Let him tell others what happens to those who threaten Cahto children." Then Lone Wolf was moving toward Julia and little Fawn. He dropped to his knees before them, his hands hovering uncertainly as if he wanted to touch his daughter, but feared she might be hurt. "Little Fawn, are you harmed?" he asked, his voice breaking on the words. "No, father," little Fawn said, reaching for him. "The plant woman protected me. She stood between me and the bad men, even though they had guns. She was not afraid." Lone Wolf finally lifted his daughter, holding her close as his eyes closed in relief. Over little Fawn's head, he looked at Julia, and she saw emotions warring in his expression. Gratitude, confusion, and something else she could not quite name. "You could have run," he said finally. "You could have called out to those men in your language. They would have taken you away from here, back to your people. You would have been free." Julia shook her head, suddenly aware that she was trembling violently now that the danger had passed. "She's a child," she said simply. "How could I leave a blind child to face armed men alone? What kind of healer would that make me? What kind of person?" Lone Wolf stared at her for a long moment, then slowly stood, little Fawn still in his arms. "Swift Otter," he called, his voice carrying a new tone of command. "Cut the bonds the white woman wears. She is no longer a captive. From this moment, Julia Mackenzie is under the protection of the Cahto people. Anyone who harms her answers to me." Swift Otter's eyes widened in surprise, but he moved to obey immediately. Using his knife to cut away the rawhide strips that still marked Julia's wrists as a prisoner. The warriors and villagers who had gathered during the commotion murmured among themselves in Cahto, their expressions ranging from approval to confusion. Grandmother Willow stepped forward, placing her weathered hand on Julia's shoulder. "You have proven your heart," the medicine woman said in her halting English. Lone Wolf's wife would have done the same. "Protected child of enemy, because child is innocent. You are true healer." Julia felt tears burning in her eyes, the relief and residual fear finally overwhelming her careful control. She had come so close to death, had seen the bullet that would have killed her, and somehow she still lived. More than that, she had gained something she had not expected: respect. "The bandits may return with more men," Gray Fox warned Lone Wolf. "They know our location now. We should prepare stronger defenses or consider moving the village." Lone Wolf nodded grimly. "Post extra sentries. Send runners to scout the approaches. We will not be caught unprepared again." He turned back to Julia. "Can Little Fawn's treatment continue despite this disruption?" Julia took a shaky breath, forcing herself back into the role of healer, using the familiar structure of medical care to steady her rattled nerves. "Yes, in fact, the bandages should come off soon for her first evaluation. We need to see if the medicine is having any effect." They returned to Lone Wolf's lodge, where Julia carefully unwrapped the cloth from Little Fawn's eyes. The child sat very still as the last layer came away, revealing eyes that looked less inflamed than before. Julia cleaned away the dried medicine with a damp cloth, then positioned Little Fawn facing the lodge entrance where afternoon sunlight streamed in. "Keep your eyes closed for a moment," Julia instructed gently. "Now very slowly, try to open them. Tell me what you see, if anything." Little Fawn's eyelids fluttered, then gradually lifted. For a long moment, she said nothing, her expression confused. Then her face transformed with wonder. "Light," she whispered. "Father, I see light. Not darkness like before, but golden light and shadows. I see a shadow where you stand." Lone Wolf's hand found Julia's shoulder, gripping it with surprising gentleness. When she looked up at him, she saw that the fierce Warchief had tears streaming down his face, though his expression remained stoic. No words passed between them, but Julia felt the depth of his gratitude in that simple touch. "This is just the beginning," Julia said softly, speaking to both father and daughter. "The inflammation is starting to reduce. With continued treatment, more vision should return. But it will take time and patience." Little Fawn turned her face toward Julia's voice, and though her gaze was still unfocused, there was new hope shining in her features. "You saved my life from the bad men, and now you give me back my eyes. How can we ever repay such gifts?" Julia thought about how she had arrived at this village as a captive, terrified and uncertain of her fate. She thought about the moment she had stood between Little Fawn and death, acting on instinct rather than calculation. She thought about Lone Wolf dropping his bow in that moment of recognition, of seeing her not as an enemy or a tool, but as someone who had chosen his daughter's life over her own freedom. "You don't need to repay anything," Julia said, reaching out to gently squeeze Little Fawn's small hand. "Healing is what I do. It's who I am. The chance to help you is gift enough." As evening settled over the Cahto village and cooking fires began to glow in the gathering darkness, Julia sat outside Lone Wolf's lodge, preparing the next treatment for Little Fawn's eyes. The Warchief sat nearby, his presence no longer feeling threatening but rather protective. The events of the day had forged something between them, an understanding that transcended the barriers of culture and circumstance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The bandits might return. The treatment might fail. 100 things could still go wrong. But for now, in this moment, a blind child had seen light for the first time in 6 months, and a captive had become a valued member of the community she had once feared. Sometimes Julia reflected as she worked. The most important bridges between worlds are built not through grand gestures or political negotiations, but through simple acts of courage and compassion in moments when everything hangs in the balance. 3 days had passed since the bandit attack, and the Cahto village had transformed into a fortress of vigilance. Warriors patrolled the perimeter in rotating shifts, and lookouts perched in the tallest redwoods kept constant watch on the valley approaches. Yet despite the tension that hummed through the camp like a plucked bowstring, something else had begun to grow alongside the fear. A cautious hope centered around the blind child who was slowly beginning to see. Julia knelt beside the stream that ran through the village, grinding fresh herbs between 2 smooth stones while Grandmother Willow sat nearby, teaching her the Cahto names for various plants. The old medicine woman had become an unexpected ally, sharing knowledge that Julia's formal training had never included. In return, Julia explained the scientific principles behind her treatments, creating a bridge between 2 healing traditions. "This one we call mountain tears," Grandmother Willow said, pointing to a cluster of small white flowers growing along the water's edge. "Good for wounds that will not close." "You call it what?" "Yarrow," Julia replied, carefully adding the crushed plant to her mixture. "We use it to stop bleeding and prevent infection. Your people have used it far longer than mine have lived on this continent." The medicine woman nodded with satisfaction. "You listen and learn. Not like other white people who think their way is only way. This is why spirits brought you to us. Little Fawn needs more than medicine for eyes. She needs someone who sees with more than one kind of sight." Before Julia could respond, Little Fawn's voice called out from the path above them. "Julia, Grandmother? Father says it is time for my treatment." The child navigated the trail with increasing confidence, her hands no longer reaching out constantly for guidance. She could now distinguish between light and shadow well enough to avoid major obstacles, though details remained frustratingly blurred. "I am here, little one," Julia called back, rising with her prepared medicines. As Little Fawn approached, Julia noticed Lone Wolf following several paces behind, his protective instincts never allowing his daughter far from his sight. In the past 3 days, Julia had witnessed a subtle shift in how the Warchief regarded her. The suspicion had been replaced by something warmer, though he maintained the formal distance appropriate to his position. They settled in the sunlight outside Lone Wolf's lodge, where Julia had established her daily ritual of treating Little Fawn's eyes. The child had learned to sit perfectly still during the applications, though Julia could sense her excitement about the gradual improvements in her vision. "Today I could see the difference between your dress and Grandmother's," Little Fawn announced proudly as Julia began her examination. "Your dress is lighter like clouds and Grandmother's is dark like the earth after rain." "I could not see that yesterday." Julia felt her heart lift at this news. "That is excellent progress. The inflammation continues to decrease, which means more light is reaching the parts of your eyes that create sight." She carefully applied fresh medicine, her movements now practiced and confident. "Tell me, can you see my face at all? Any features or just a general shape?" Little Fawn concentrated, her improving eyes fixed somewhere near Julia's chin. "I see the shape of your head and something dark where your mouth is when you speak. But I cannot see your eyes yet, or the color you told me about." "The red hair like sunset. Patience," Julia counseled, though she understood the child's eagerness. "Vision returns gradually, like dawn spreading across the sky. You cannot rush the sun to rise faster, but you can trust that it will continue to brighten." Lone Wolf, who had been listening silently, spoke for the first time that morning. "In 3 days, she has regained what 6 months of darkness took away. If this progress continues, how much sight will return?" Julia chose her words carefully, aware that she walked a delicate line between encouraging hope and promising more than she could deliver. "Honestly, I cannot say with certainty. The fact that she is improving at all suggests the damage was not permanent, which is the best possible scenario. She may regain full vision, or she may always have some limitations. The human eye is complex, and fever can affect it in ways we do not fully understand. What I can promise is that I will continue treatments as long as they show benefit and cause no harm. And how long will you stay to provide these treatments? Lone Wolf asked, his voice neutral but his eyes intense. Your people in the settlement must wonder what has become of you. Surely they search still. Julia had been thinking about this question herself. Nearly a week had passed since her capture, far longer than her planned gathering trip. Dr. Adams would be frantic with worry, and there was the pregnant woman who needed her care. Yet the thought of leaving before little Fawn's treatment was complete felt impossible, like abandoning a patient in the middle of surgery. I will stay as long as little Fawn needs me, Julia said firmly. My mentor will understand. He taught me that a healer's first duty is to the patient, regardless of the circumstances. When her vision is stable and you can continue the treatments without me, then I will return. But not before. Something shifted in Lone Wolf's expression, a warmth that briefly broke through his stoic mask. You speak of duty, but I think there is more than duty keeping you here. You care for my daughter as if she were your own. Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks, surprised by his perceptiveness. She reminds me of what I have lost, she admitted quietly. My husband and I wanted children, but he died before we could start a family. Perhaps that is why I feel so strongly about helping her. She deserves every chance at a full life, just as any child does. Before Lone Wolf could respond, Swift Otter came running up the path, his young face flushed with urgency. He spoke rapidly in Cahto, gesturing toward the eastern approach to the village. Lone Wolf's expression hardened immediately. What is it? Julia asked, tension knotting in her stomach. Riders approaching, Lone Wolf translated, already moving toward his weapons. 3 men on horses, carrying a white flag. Gray Fox thinks they are from your settlement, coming to negotiate for your return. Julia's heart leaped with conflicting emotions. Part of her longed to see Dr. Adams, to reassure him she was alive and well. But another part, a part that surprised her with its strength, resisted the idea of leaving before her work was complete. A white flag means they want to talk peacefully, she said. Will you hear what they have to say? Lone Wolf studied her face for a long moment. I will hear them because you ask it. But I make no promises. If they demand your return and threaten war if we refuse, I will not surrender you like a prisoner. You are free to choose whether to go or stay. The delegation arrived an hour later, escorted by Cahto warriors to the village center where Lone Wolf waited with his council of elders. Julia stood beside him, having insisted on being present for any discussions about her fate. Little Fawn clung to her hand, the child's newly regained shadow vision allowing her to sense the tension in the gathering crowd. Julia's breath caught as she recognized the lead rider. Dr. William Adams sat tall in his saddle despite his 60 years. His white beard neatly trimmed and his medical bag slung across his shoulder as always. Beside him rode Thomas Crawford, the settlement's blacksmith, and a man known for his level head and fair dealing. The third man was younger, a rancher named Pete Sullivan, who had a reputation for treating all people equally. Red or white, Julia? Dr. Adams called out, relief flooding his weathered face as he spotted her. Thank God you are alive. We feared the worst when you did not return. I am well, Dr. Adams, Julia replied, stepping forward. I am here of my own choice now, treating a patient who needs my skills. The doctor's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise, but before he could respond, Thomas Crawford spoke. Miss Mackenzie, we have been searching for you for 6 days. The whole settlement has been worried sick. Lieutenant Wilson wanted to bring soldiers and search every native camp in the territory. But we convinced him to let us try peaceful negotiations first. Lone Wolf's jaw tightened at the mention of soldiers, but he remained silent, listening intently as Julia translated the conversation for him in her improving Cahto. Dr. Adams dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene with the physician's trained observation. He noticed Julia's torn but clean dress, her unbandaged wrists, the way she stood confidently beside the Cahto warchief rather than cowering behind him. Most tellingly, he noticed the small blind girl holding Julia's hand and the way Julia's fingers gently squeezed the child's in reassurance. "You have a patient here," he said, understanding dawning in his expression. "A child who needs your care." "Yes," Julia confirmed. "Little Fawn lost her sight to fever 6 months ago. I have been treating her, and her vision is beginning to return. But the treatments must continue for several more weeks to ensure the improvement is permanent. I cannot leave her now." Dr. Adams looked at Lone Wolf, then back at Julia. "And these people, they are treating you well? You are here by choice, not coercion?" "I am here entirely by choice," Julia said firmly. "I was captured initially, yes, but Lone Wolf freed me after I proved my intentions were genuine. I stay now because my patient needs me, and because I have found something here I did not expect. Respect for my skills and acceptance of my methods, regardless of where I came from." Pete Sullivan shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Mackenzie, that is all well and good, but folks in the settlement are talking. They say the Cahto kidnapped you, maybe killed you. Lieutenant Wilson is using your disappearance to push for military action against native camps. If you do not return soon and show yourself alive and well, he will have the excuse he needs to bring soldiers into these mountains." Julia felt Lone Wolf tense beside her, and she quickly translated Sullivan's warning. The warchief's face became an unreadable mask, but she could sense the calculations running behind his dark eyes. He was weighing his daughter's need against the safety of his entire people. "There must be a solution that serves everyone," Julia said desperately, looking between the settlement men and Lone Wolf. "Dr. Adams, you understand better than anyone that abandoning a patient mid-treatment goes against everything we stand for as healers. But I also understand that my absence is creating problems. What if I returned briefly to show I am well, then came back to continue Little Fawn's care?" Dr. Adams stroked his beard thoughtfully. "That might work if the Cahto warchief agrees to allow you free passage both ways. But Julia, you must understand how unusual this situation is. A white woman, living among natives, treating a native child. There will be those who see this as betrayal, as choosing their side over your own people." "There are no sides in medicine," Julia said sharply. "There are only patients who need healing and healers who have the knowledge to help them. I did not stop being a healer when I was captured, and I will not stop being one now because it makes some people uncomfortable." Lone Wolf spoke for the first time, his English heavily accented, but clear enough for the white men to understand. "Julia Mackenzie stays because she chooses, not because we hold her. She has saved my daughter's life twice, once from blindness and once from bad men who would have hurt her. She is honored guest of Cahto people. Any who harm her will answer to me." Thomas Crawford leaned forward in his saddle, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Lone Wolf, I have known Julia Mackenzie for 2 years. She delivered my grandson and saved my wife when the fever went through our settlement last winter. If she says your daughter needs her care, then I believe her. What can we do to help resolve this situation peacefully?" Gray Fox, who had been standing silently behind Lone Wolf, stepped forward and spoke in rapid Cahto. Lone Wolf listened, then nodded slowly before turning to the white delegation. Gray Fox suggests a trait of knowledge. Lone Wolf translated his warrior's idea. "Julia Mackenzie returns to your settlement for 2 days to show she lives and is well. She brings supplies she needs for Little Fawn's treatment. In return, she teaches Grandmother Willow and me how to continue treatments if something prevents Julia from returning. This way, Little Fawn's healing continues no matter what happens, and your people see that we do not hold Julia against her will." Dr. Adams considered this proposal, clearly impressed by its fairness. "That seems reasonable. Julia, what do you think?" Julia looked down at little Fawn, whose unseeing eyes were fixed trustingly on her face. The child could not see the details of this negotiation, but she could hear the tension in every voice and feel the weight of the decision in how tightly Julia gripped her hand. "Will you come back?" Little Fawn asked softly, her voice trembling slightly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"Or will your people make you stay away from us?" Julia knelt down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "I will come back," she promised. "I give you my word, little Fawn. I will bring more medicines, and I will continue your treatments until your sight is fully restored. No one can make me break a promise to a patient." Lone Wolf placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "The white healer speaks truth. I have learned to hear it in her voice, just as you have. She will return." The next morning, Julia prepared to leave for the settlement. Her medical bag repacked with specimens of the plants she had been using and detailed notes on little Fawn's treatment progress. Grandmother Willow had spent the previous evening learning the exact proportions of each medicine and the proper application techniques. Her old hands surprisingly steady as she practiced under Julia's guidance. "You take this," the medicine woman said, pressing a small leather pouch into Julia's hands. "Cahto protection charm. Keep you safe on journey and remind you that you have family here now, waiting for your return." Julia's eyes stung with unexpected tears as she accepted the gift. "Thank you, grandmother. I will treasure it." Little Fawn stood beside her father, her posture brave despite the anxiety Julia could read in every line of her small body. "2 days, the child said firmly. "You said you would be gone only 2 days." 2 days, Julia confirmed, kneeling to embrace the child. "And when I return, we will continue your treatments and work on helping you see more details. Perhaps by the time leaves turn red in autumn, you will be able to see them clearly." Lone Wolf stepped forward as Julia stood. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, an entire conversation happening in the silence between them. Then the warchief reached up and removed the leather cord from around his neck. Strung on it was a bear claw, polished smooth by years of wear. "My father gave this to me when I became a warrior," he said quietly. "It represents courage and protection. You have shown both in abundance. Wear it so others know you are under the protection of the Cahto warchief. Any who harm you insult me personally." Julia accepted the cord with trembling hands, understanding the significance of this gesture. Among his people, such a gift marked her as family, as someone worthy of his personal protection and respect. She slipped it over her head, feeling the weight of the bear claw settle against her chest. "I will wear it with honor," she said. "And I will return, Lone Wolf. That is my promise to you and to your daughter." As Julia rode away from the village with Swift Otter and Gray Fox as her escorts, she turned back once to see Lone Wolf and Little Fawn standing together, watching her departure. The warchief had his hand on his daughter's shoulder, and even from a distance, Julia could see the child's small hand raised in farewell. The 2 days in the settlement would test everything she had committed to. She would face questions, judgments, and possibly condemnation for her choices. Lieutenant Wilson would undoubtedly try to extract information about the Cahto village location and defenses. Dr. Adams would want detailed explanations of her treatment methods and her reasons for returning to the native camp. But as Julia touched the bear claw hanging around her neck and felt the weight of Grandmother Willow's protection charm in her pocket, she knew with absolute certainty that she would return. She had found something in that Cahto village that she had been searching for since Thomas died. A purpose that transcended the boundaries others tried to impose. A family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. Little Fawn needed her, and Julia Mackenzie had never abandoned a patient yet. She was not about to start now, regardless of what the next 2 days might bring. The settlement of Redwood Creek sprawled along the valley floor like a hasty afterthought. its buildings thrown together from rough-cut lumber and optimism. Julia rode through the main street between Swift Otter and Gray Fox, acutely aware of how every face turned to stare at the spectacle they presented. A white woman returning from Cahto territory, flanked by 2 native warriors wearing a bear claw necklace that marked her as something unprecedented in this frontier community. Whispers followed their progress, like ripples spreading across still water. Women pulled their children closer, their faces showing mixtures of relief, curiosity, and disapproval. Men emerged from the general store and saloon, hands moving unconsciously toward weapons they wore at their hips. Julia sat straighter in her saddle, refusing to show the nervousness that fluttered in her chest. Dr. Adams waited outside his clinic, his medical bag already in hand as though he had been preparing for house calls. His weathered face showed relief as Julia dismounted, but his experienced eyes took in every detail of her appearance, with the clinical assessment of a physician evaluating a patient. The torn dress that had been carefully mended with Cahto stitching, the sun-darkened skin on her face and arms, the confident way she moved despite her ordeal, and most significantly, the bear claw hanging prominently around her neck. "Julia," he said warmly, embracing her briefly before holding her at arm's length to study her face. "You look remarkably well for someone who has been held captive for nearly a week. Though I suspect there is far more to this story than the rumors suggest, there is much to tell you," Julia agreed, glancing at Swift Otter and Gray Fox, who remained mounted, their faces impassive but their eyes constantly scanning for threats. "But first, I need to assure these men that I am safe here and will be ready to return to the village in 2 days as promised." Dr. Adams's eyebrows rose at the word promised, but he nodded understanding. "Your escorts are welcome to make camp on the edge of town. I will personally guarantee their safety and yours. No harm will come to any of you while you are under my protection." Swift Otter, whose English was better than he typically let on, spoke directly to Dr. Adams. "We stay close to Julia Mackenzie. Lone Wolf commands this. If white men try to keep her here or harm her, we report this, and many warriors come. This is not threat, only truth." "I understand completely," Dr. Adams replied with surprising diplomacy. "You are protecting someone precious to your chief. I would do the same in your position. There is a sheltered area near my stable where you can make camp. I will see that food and water are provided." As Swift Otter and Gray Fox led their horses away, Julia noticed a group of men gathering outside the saloon. Among them stood Lieutenant James Wilson, his blue cavalry uniform dusty from travel, but his bearing rigid with military authority. His face was flushed with anger as he strode toward Julia and Dr. Adams. "Miss Mackenzie," Wilson said, his voice sharp with barely controlled rage. "I have spent the past week organizing search parties and preparing military operations to rescue you from savage captors. Now you return dressed like a squaw, wearing their trinkets, with their warriors as escorts. Perhaps you can explain this outrageous situation." Julia felt anger kindle in her chest at his tone and his choice of words. "Lieutenant Wilson, I can explain it quite simply. I was initially captured while gathering medicinal plants, but I was released after I agreed to treat a sick child. I remain in the Cahto village by choice, as a guest, not a captive. The warriors you see are here to ensure my safe passage, not to guard a prisoner." Wilson's face darkened further. "You expect me to believe you choose to live among savages? That you prefer their company to civilized people? This is either delusion brought on by your ordeal, or something far worse, collaboration with enemies of the United States." "Enemies?" Julia's voice rose despite her attempt to remain calm. "They are people, Lieutenant Wilson. Families trying to survive while their lands are taken and their way of life destroyed. The child I am treating is 8 years old and was blind until I began helping her. She is not my enemy. She is my patient. And I will not abandon her because you find my choices uncomfortable, Dr. Adams placed a restraining hand on Julia's arm. "Lieutenant, Perhaps we could discuss this more privately. Julia has been through a significant ordeal, and she needs time to rest and recover. What she needs is to answer questions about the location and strength of the Cahto encampment, Wilson countered. Information that could prevent future attacks and kidnappings. Miss Mackenzie, you have a duty to your own people. Julia met his glare without flinching. My duty as a healer is to all people, regardless of race or nationality. I will not provide information that would be used to attack a village where I have been welcomed and where I am treating patients. To do so would violate every oath I have taken. Thomas Crawford had approached during the confrontation, his blacksmith's bulk and calm demeanor seeming to ease the tension slightly. Lieutenant, Julia has made her position clear. She is here of her own free will and will return to continue her medical work. Perhaps we should respect that choice rather than force a confrontation that serves no one. Wilson turned his sharp gaze on Crawford. You would support this betrayal? This woman has clearly been influenced by her captors, possibly through threats or manipulation we cannot see. She needs to be detained for her own protection until we can properly assess her mental state. If you try to detain me, Julia said quietly but with steel in her voice, those two warriors will report to Lone Wolf that I was held against my will. That would be seen as an act of war, Lieutenant. Is that what you want? To start a conflict over a healer who is voluntarily helping a sick child? The standoff might have escalated further, but Pete Sullivan stepped forward from the gathering crowd. Seems to me Miss Mackenzie has the right to make her own choices. She is not a soldier under your command, Lieutenant. She is a free citizen who happens to be doing her job as a healer. I do not see the crime in that. Other voices from the crowd murmured agreement, and Julia realized with surprise that she had more support than she had anticipated. These were people who had benefited from her skills over the past 2 years, mothers whose children she had delivered, men whose injuries she had treated, families she had helped through illness and grief. Wilson recognized he was losing the argument, and his face hardened with the expression of a man who would remember this humiliation. Very well, but understand this, Miss Mackenzie. If your actions lead to anyone in this settlement being harmed, if your cooperation with the Cahto results in attacks or raids, I will hold you personally responsible, and I will ensure you face the consequences. He turned on his heel and strode away, his posture radiating fury and wounded pride. Julia watched him go, knowing she had made a dangerous enemy, but unable to regret her choices. Dr. Adams guided her toward his clinic, his hand gentle but firm on her elbow. Come inside, Julia. You need food, rest, and we need to talk privately about what has happened to you. Inside the familiar surroundings of the clinic, with its shelves of medicines and the examining table where she had assisted with countless procedures, Julia felt the tension finally drain from her shoulders. Dr. Adams prepared tea, while she sat in the worn wooden chair by his desk. The same chair where they had shared so many conversations about medical cases and frontier life. Now then, he said, handing her a steaming cup. Tell me everything, and do not spare the details. I want to understand what has truly happened. Not the rumors and speculation that have been flying through town. Julia spent the next hour recounting her capture, her examination of Little Fawn, the bandit attack, and the gradual building of trust between her and the Cahto people. Dr. Adams listened without interruption, his expression shifting from concern to professional interest as she described Little Fawn's condition and her treatment approach. Fever-induced optic nerve inflammation, he mused when she finished. I have read about such cases but never treated one personally. Your approach sounds medically sound, combining anti-inflammatory herbs with circulation stimulation. And you say the child has already regained shadow vision? Yes, and it improves daily, Julia confirmed. But the treatment must continue for several more weeks to ensure the inflammation does not return and to maximize her visual recovery. That is why I must go back, Dr. Adams. I cannot abandon her mid-treatment. The old physician studied her face for a long moment. You care for this child deeply. I can hear it in your voice, see it in your eyes. She has become more than just a patient to you, Julia nodded, not trusting herself to speak as emotions threatened to overwhelm her careful control. Dr. Adams reached across his desk and took her hand. Then you must return and finish what you have started, he said simply. A healer who abandons patients for political convenience is no healer at all. I taught you that, and I am proud you have not forgotten it, even under such difficult circumstances. You understand then, Julia said, relief flooding through her. I was afraid you would try to convince me to stay, to give up on little Fawn because helping her is complicated and dangerous. Medicine is always complicated and often dangerous, Dr. Adams replied with a slight smile. That has never stopped you before. Why should it stop you now? Besides, his expression grew more serious. What you are doing goes beyond treating one child. You are building a bridge between two communities that have known only suspicion and violence. If you succeed, if you can show both sides that healing knows no boundaries, you may prevent far more suffering than one case of blindness. Over the next 2 days, Julia prepared methodically for her return to the Cahto village. She gathered additional medical supplies, carefully explaining each item's purpose to Dr. Adams so he could record it in his journals. She visited the pregnant woman she had been concerned about before her capture, finding her condition stable but still requiring careful monitoring. I will be away for several more weeks, Julia explained to the woman and her worried husband. But Dr. Adams can handle any complications that arise. He has far more experience with difficult births than I do. The woman, a miner's wife named Sarah, gripped Julia's hand tightly. They are saying terrible things about you in town, Miss Mackenzie. That you have betrayed your own kind, that you have become one of them. But I remember how you sat with me all night when my first baby had the fever, how you would not leave until you were certain he would survive. You are a healer, through and through. Anyone with eyes can see that. Julia felt tears prick her eyes at these words of support. Thank you, Sarah. That means more to me than you can know. Not everyone was as understanding. Julia encountered cold stares and whispered insults as she moved through town preparing for her departure. Several women she had considered friends crossed the street to avoid speaking with her. The minister's wife made a pointed comment about those who fraternize with heathens, loud enough for Julia to hear clearly, but there were also unexpected allies. The general store owner, a gruff man named Henderson who rarely spoke more than necessary, pressed a package of supplies into her hands. For the child you are treating, he said simply. My daughter died of fever 5 years ago. If you can save another father from that grief, then you do God's work regardless of what the gossips say. On her final evening in the settlement, Julia sat with Dr. Adams in his clinic, going over the detailed treatment notes she had prepared. If something prevents me from returning, she said, though the thought made her chest tight with anxiety, these instructions will allow Grandmother Willow and Lone Wolf to continue Little Fawn's care. The medicine woman is remarkably skilled. With the right guidance, she can complete the treatment. Dr. Adams studied the notes with his usual thoroughness, occasionally asking questions or suggesting refinements. You have done excellent work here, Julia. This documentation is as thorough as any I have seen from trained physicians. But tell me honestly, do you truly believe nothing will prevent your return? Lieutenant Wilson is not a man who forgives perceived slights. He may try to stop you. He can try, Julia said with more confidence than she felt. But I have made promises to a little girl and her father. I do not break my promises, Dr. Adams. You taught me that too. The old physician smiled, his eyes crinkling with affection and pride. I taught you well then. Go back to your patient, Julia. Finish what you have started. And know that you have my complete support, regardless of what others may say or do. That night, Julia lay awake in the small room she rented above the general store, her mind too full for sleep. Through her window, she could see the campfire where Swift Otter and Gray Fox maintained their vigil, never leaving their post, always watching to ensure her safety. The sight comforted her in ways she had not expected. She thought about little Fawn's small hand in hers, the child's growing excitement as her vision slowly returned. She thought about Lone Wolf's rare smiles when his daughter showed new progress, the way his stoic mask crumbled briefly to reveal the loving father beneath. She thought about Grandmother Willow's patient teaching and the warriors who had accepted her presence without judgment when she had proven herself. Somewhere in the past week, Julia realized the Cahto village had stopped feeling like a foreign place where she was held captive. It had become something else entirely, a community where her skills were valued, where her dedication to healing was understood and respected without qualification. A place where she had found purpose and belonging in ways the settlement had never provided. The bare claw resting against her chest felt warm, as though it carried some of Lone Wolf's protective strength. The leather pouch Grandmother Willow had given her lay on the small table beside her bed, its Cahto symbols promising safe passage and return. These were not the gifts given to an outsider or an enemy. They were gifts given to family, as dawn broke over the settlement on her third morning. Julia gathered her supplies and prepared to leave. Dr. Adams walked with her to where Swift Otter and Gray Fox waited with the horses, his medical bag slung over his shoulder as though he might accompany her on rounds. "You are doing something important, Julia," he said quietly as she prepared to mount. "Not just treating a sick child, though that alone would be worthwhile. You are proving that compassion and healing can transcend the artificial boundaries we create between peoples. Some will never understand or accept that. But those of us who truly understand medicine, we know you are right." "Never doubt that." Julia embraced him briefly, this man who had been mentor and father figure since Thomas died. "Thank you for believing in me, for supporting my choice even when it would have been easier to demand I stay." "A good teacher knows when the student has surpassed them," Dr. Adams replied with a warm smile. "You have grown into a healer I could never have been, Julia, one who sees patience instead of politics, humanity instead of difference. That is a rare and precious gift. Use it well." As Julia rode out of the settlement between Swift Otter and Gray Fox, she felt eyes watching from windows and doorways. Some of those gazes held approval, others condemnation, but Julia no longer cared what the gossips thought. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it. Lieutenant Wilson stood outside the saloon, his face a mask of cold fury as he watched her departure. Julia met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not apologize for being a healer who treated all patients equally. The trail back to the Cahto village wound through towering redwoods and across clear streams, the morning sun filtering through the canopy to create patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. With each mile that passed, Julia felt the tension from the settlement draining away, replaced by anticipation of returning to her patient and continuing the work she had started. "Little Fawn will be happy you return," Swift Otter said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over their journey. "She has counted the hours since you left." Lone Wolf also, though he tries to hide his concern behind the face of a war chief. Julia smiled at this insight. "I am eager to see them both, to check on Little Fawn's progress and ensure the treatments Grandmother Willow has been administering have maintained the improvements we achieved before I left." Gray Fox, who rarely spoke, turned to look at her with his weathered face thoughtful. "You have changed something in our village," he said slowly. "Before you came, there was only anger toward white people, only memory of broken promises and stolen land. You have shown us that not all outsiders are the same, that some still understand honor and keep their word. This is a valuable gift, perhaps more valuable than the healing you bring to Lone Wolf's daughter." "I only did what any healer should do," Julia protested, but Gray Fox shook his head. Many white healers would not have stayed when they had chance to leave. Many would not have protected a Cahto child at risk to themselves. You did both without hesitation. This is why Lone Wolf gave you the bear claw, why Grandmother Willow calls you daughter now. You have earned these honors through your actions, not your words. As they crested the final ridge before the valley where the Cahto village nestled among the ancient trees, Julia saw smoke rising from cooking fires and heard the distant sounds of daily life. Somewhere down there, a little girl waited for her return, and a father dared to hope his daughter might fully heal. Julia touched the bear claw at her throat and felt the weight of Grandmother Willow's protection charm in her pocket. She was going home, she realized with sudden clarity. Not to the settlement where she had lived for 2 years, but to this village where she had found her truest purpose. The realization should have frightened her. This fundamental shift in where she belonged. Instead, it filled her with a peace she had not felt since Thomas died. A sense that she was finally exactly where she was meant to be. The Cahto village erupted with activity the moment the lookout spotted Julia's return. Children ran alongside the horses as Swift Otter and Gray Fox escorted her through the camp, their excited voices calling out news of her arrival. Warriors paused in their work to nod acknowledgement, and women emerged from their lodges with expressions that held genuine warmth rather than the suspicion that had marked her first days among them. But Julia's eyes searched for only 2 figures. She found them standing together outside Lone Wolf's lodge, father and daughter positioned as though they had been waiting in that exact spot for hours. Little Fawn's face was turned toward the commotion, her improving vision allowing her to track movement and shapes even if details remained blurred. Lone Wolf stood with one hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder, his stoic expression not quite hiding the relief in his dark eyes. Julia dismounted before the horses had fully stopped, her eagerness overcoming the dignity she had tried to maintain during her ceremonial return. She hurried toward Little Fawn, dropping to her knees so they were at eye level. The child's arms wrapped around her neck immediately, holding tight with the desperate strength of someone who had feared they might never see a loved one again. "You came back," Little Fawn whispered against Julia's shoulder. "Father said you would, and Grandmother said the spirits promised it, but I was still afraid. The white people could have made you stay. They could have said you belonged with them, not with us." Julia pulled back slightly so she could study Little Fawn's face, her healer's eye automatically assessing the child's condition. "I made you a promise, little one. I never break my promises to patients. Besides," she smiled, touching the bear claw that still hung around her neck, "I am under the protection of a Cahto warchief. That is not something I take lightly." Lone Wolf moved closer, and Julia rose to face him. For a moment they simply looked at each other, an entire conversation happening in the silence between them. Julia saw question and concern in his expression, worry that the 2 days in her settlement might have reminded her of obligations that outweighed her commitment to his daughter. "I brought additional medicines and supplies," Julia said, gesturing to the pack Swift Otter was unloading. "Dr. Adams, my mentor, sends his respect and asks that I report on Little Fawn's progress when next I visit. He believes what we are doing here is important, not just for your daughter but as an example of what healing can accomplish when it transcends boundaries." Something in Lone Wolf's expression softened, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Your teacher is wise. Come, Grandmother Willow has maintained Little Fawn's treatments as you instructed. But we are eager to hear if the progress continues, or if we have made errors in your absence." Inside the lodge, Julia conducted the most thorough examination she had yet performed. Grandmother Willow watched intently, ready to learn from any corrections or refinements Julia might suggest. But as Julia worked, checking Little Fawn's eyes under different lighting conditions and testing her ability to distinguish colors and shapes, she found herself increasingly impressed with the medicine woman's careful adherence to the treatment protocol. "The inflammation continues to decrease," Julia reported, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. Little Fawn, can you see my face more clearly now? Try to describe what you see. Little Fawn concentrated, her improving eyes focusing on Julia with determination that showed how desperately she wanted to see clearly again. I can see your eyes now, she said slowly. They are green like new leaves in spring. And your hair, it is the color Father said, like sunset fire. I can see your smile, and the way your face moves when you talk. It is still blurry at the edges like looking through water, but so much better than before. Julia felt tears threatening and blinked them back rapidly. Lone Wolf's hand came to rest on her shoulder, his grip conveying gratitude deeper than words could express. This is more than I dared hope for, he said quietly. My daughter sees again. She recognizes faces and colors. Even if her vision never improves beyond this point. You have given her back so much of what we thought was lost forever. Her vision will continue to improve, Julia assured him, finally allowing herself to fully believe it. The rate of progress suggests the inflammation is resolving completely rather than just partially. With continued treatment over the next few weeks, she should regain nearly full vision. There may always be slight blurriness in certain conditions, but she will be able to live a normal life. To run and play and eventually learn all the skills she would have learned if the fever had never happened. Grandmother Willow spoke in rapid Cahto, her weathered face creased with emotion. Lone Wolf translated, though Julia was beginning to understand more of the language herself. Grandmother says you have proven yourself a true healer, one whose skill comes not just from knowledge but from genuine care for your patients. She asks if you would be willing to share more of your healing methods with her. To learn together how to combine Cahto medicine and white medicine for the benefit of all people. I would be honored, Julia replied, meaning it with her whole heart. I have already learned so much from Grandmother Willow. To continue that exchange of knowledge would be a privilege. Over the following weeks, a remarkable transformation occurred in the Cahto village. Julia's presence became not just accepted, but celebrated as Little Fawn's vision continued its steady improvement. The child who had navigated the world through sound and touch began running again, playing with other children. Laughing as she chased butterflies, she could now see dancing through the meadow grass. But Julia's healing work expanded beyond her initial patient. Warriors began approaching her with injuries they had previously hidden, trusting her skills enough to seek treatment. Women brought children with persistent coughs or mysterious rashes. The elderly came with aches and pains they had learned to live with but hoped might be eased. Julia found herself working alongside Grandmother Willow almost constantly, each case becoming an opportunity to combine their different medical traditions. One afternoon, as Julia prepared medicines outside her lodge, now positioned near Grandmother Willow's dwelling at the center of the village, Lone Wolf approached with an unusual request. There is something I would show you, he said. A place sacred to my people. I think you have earned the right to see it. Julia followed him through trails that wound deeper into the forest, climbing steadily until they emerged on a high ridge overlooking the entire valley. Below, she could see the village nestled among the trees, smoke rising from cooking fires, the stream glinting silver in the afternoon sun. But Lone Wolf guided her attention to a grove of ancient redwoods that stood apart from the others, their massive trunks forming a natural cathedral. This is where we come to speak with the spirits of our ancestors, Lone Wolf explained as they entered the grove. My wife is buried here, along with the elders who have guided our people for generations. I wanted you to meet her, in a way, to understand why what you have done for Little Fawn means so much to me. He led Julia to a simple grave marker, stones arranged in a careful pattern with a carved piece of wood marking the head. Her name was Bright Morning, he said softly. She was a healer like you, perhaps the finest our people had known in many generations. She believed healing should know no boundaries, that suffering was suffering regardless of who experienced it. The elders disagreed, said she should not waste her skills on outsiders. But she could not turn away from anyone who needed help. Julia knelt beside the grave, touching the stones gently. Little Fawn said her mother died healing others. Lone Wolf nodded, pain flickering across his stoic features. White prospectors came to the mountains with a terrible sickness. Many were dying. Bright Morning went to help them despite my warnings, despite knowing the risk. She saved 17 men before the sickness took her. When I tried to be angry at those she had saved, to blame them for her death, I could not. She had made her choice freely, and it was the choice of a true healer. She would have been disappointed in me if I had turned into a man who could not see beyond hate and revenge. That is why you let me treat Little Fawn, Julia said, understanding dawning. Why you gave me the chance when others wanted you to refuse. You were honoring your wife's beliefs. At first, yes, Lone Wolf admitted. But you have become more than just a reminder of Bright Morning. You have your own strength, your own courage, your own way of seeing past the divisions that separate peoples. Little Fawn loves you not because you replaced her mother, but because you are Julia, the healer who protected her from bandits and gave her back her sight. And he paused, seeming to search for words. I have come to value you for who you are, not just for what you represent. Julia felt her heart racing at the intensity in his voice, at the unspoken implications beneath his careful words. Lone Wolf, you do not need to speak, he said gently. I only wanted you to know that you have found a home here if you wish it. Not as a visitor or even as an honored guest, but as one of us. Little Fawn has begun calling you second mother when she thinks I cannot hear. Grandmother Willow has already adopted you in her heart. The village accepts you as Cahto in all but birth. If you wish to stay permanently, to make your life among us, you would be welcomed with joy. Julia looked out over the valley, at the village that had become more home to her than any place since Thomas died. She thought about the settlement where Lieutenant Wilson waited to condemn her choices, where whispers followed her through streets, where her dedication to healing all people was seen as betrayal rather than virtue. Then she thought about the lodge where Little Fawn slept peacefully each night, her vision restored and her future bright. She thought about Grandmother Willow's patient teaching and the warriors who now greeted her with respect. She thought about the profound sense of purpose she felt each day, knowing her skills were valued and needed without qualification. I cannot promise to stay forever, Julia said slowly, choosing her words with care. Dr. Adams is aging, and the settlement needs healers even if some people there do not appreciate the work we do. But I can promise that this village, these people, Little Fawn and you have become as much my family as any blood relatives could be. Whatever time I can spend here, I will. And when I must return to the settlement, I will come back as often as possible. My heart has room for both worlds, and I refuse to choose between them when I can serve both. Lone Wolf nodded, accepting this compromise with understanding in his eyes. Then we will welcome you for however long you can stay, and we will wait for your return when you must leave. This is enough. More than enough. As summer deepened into early autumn, Little Fawn's vision continued to improve until the day came, when Julia had to admit there was nothing more her treatments could accomplish. The child's eyes were as healed as they would ever be, her vision clear and strong with only the slightest difficulty focusing on very distant objects. It was time for Julia to make a decision about her own future. The night before she planned to return to the settlement, the Cahto people gathered for a ceremony in Julia's honor. Warriors performed traditional dances while drums echoed through the village. Grandmother Willow presented Julia with a beautifully crafted medicine bag, made from doeskin and decorated with intricate beadwork that had taken weeks to complete. This marks you as healer of two peoples, the old woman said in her improving English. When you wear this, both Cahto and white people will know you walk between worlds, bringing healing to all. It is great responsibility, but you have proven you can carry it with wisdom and courage, Little Fawn. Wearing a new dress embroidered with flowers she could now see clearly, held Julia's hand throughout the ceremony. You will come back? She asked for perhaps the 100th time since Julia had announced her departure. I will always come back, Julia promised, meaning it with every fiber of her being. You are my patient, my friend, and my family now. Those bonds do not break simply because I must travel between two homes. Lone Wolf approached as the ceremony concluded, carrying something wrapped in soft leather. He unwrapped it to reveal a beautifully carved wooden box inlaid with abalone shell. This belonged to Bright Morning, he said. She kept her most precious healing tools in it. I want you to have it, to carry your medicines between our worlds. She would have wanted another healer who understands the true meaning of medicine to possess it. Julia accepted the box with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the significance of this gift. I will treasure it always, she whispered. And I will try to live up to the example Bright Morning set, to see patience rather than politics, humanity rather than difference. You already do, Lone Wolf said softly. That is why you belong here as much as you belong in your settlement. You have created something new, Julia Mackenzie. A bridge between peoples built not on treaties or negotiations, but on the simple act of healing a sick child without regard for anything except her need. This is how true peace begins, with small acts of courage and compassion that remind us we are all human beneath the surface differences. The next morning, Julia prepared to leave for the settlement with a promise to return within 2 weeks. She packed her supplies carefully, including dried herbs. Grandmother Willow had prepared and detailed notes on cases they had treated together. Dr. Adams would be fascinated by what she had learned, and Julia looked forward to sharing the knowledge that came from combining two medical traditions. Little Fawn walked beside her to the edge of the village, the child's steps now confident and sure as she navigated the familiar paths with fully restored vision. When you come back, will you teach me to read? She asked suddenly. Father says you have knowledge written in books. I want to learn so I can read about healing and maybe become a healer too someday. Julia stopped, kneeling to meet Little Fawn's eyes. Those eyes that now saw clearly and held such intelligence and determination. I would be honored to teach you, she said. And I think you would make an excellent healer. You already understand the most important lesson. That healing requires not just knowledge but compassion and the ability to see the person behind the illness. Lone Wolf had assigned Swift Otter and Gray Fox to escort her again, but this time it felt different. They were not guards watching a captive or even protectors ensuring safe passage. They were friends seeing off a member of their community who would return soon. The distinction mattered more than Julia could have imagined just weeks ago. As they rode toward the settlement, Julia looked back once at the Cahto village. She saw Lone Wolf standing tall at the village edge, Little Fawn beside him waving enthusiastically now that she could see Julia in the distance. Grandmother Willow stood with other villagers, all of them watching her departure with faces that held affection rather than suspicion. The settlement of Redwood Creek looked different as Julia rode in this time. Or perhaps she was the one who had changed, who now saw her own people through new eyes. The wooden buildings seemed temporary and fragile compared to the ancient redwoods that sheltered the Cahto village. The busy main street felt chaotic after the ordered rhythms of indigenous life. Even the faces that turned to watch her return seemed harder, more closed, less willing to see beyond surface appearances. But Dr. Adams waited outside his clinic with a welcoming smile that reminded Julia not everyone in the settlement was narrow-minded. Some people, the best people, understood that healing and compassion knew no boundaries. Welcome home, he said, embracing her warmly. Though I suspect home means something different to you now than it did before you were captured all those weeks ago. Home has become more complicated, Julia admitted. And more wonderful for that complication. I have so much to tell you, Dr. Adams. So much we have learned about combining different healing traditions. I think what we have discovered could change how medicine is practiced on this frontier, if people are willing to learn. The old physician's eyes lit with the enthusiasm of a true scientist encountering new knowledge. "Then come inside and tell me everything. And Julia," he added as they walked toward the clinic, "I am proud of you. What you have accomplished goes far beyond treating one child's blindness. You have proven that the divisions we create between peoples are artificial, that at our core we all want the same things: health for our children, peace for our communities, and the chance to live with dignity. Never forget the importance of what you have done." Over the following months, Julia established a pattern that would define the rest of her life. She divided her time between the settlement and the Cahto village, bringing healing to both communities and slowly, patiently building understanding between peoples who had known only conflict. She trained both Dr. Adams and Grandmother Willow in techniques the other had not known, creating a synthesis of medical knowledge that proved more effective than either tradition alone. Little Fawn did learn to read, devouring every medical text Julia could provide and showing a natural aptitude for healing that reminded everyone of her mother. Lieutenant Wilson eventually left the territory, transferred after his increasingly erratic demands for military action against peaceful native bands drew official censure. New settlers arrived who had not been taught to fear all indigenous peoples, who were willing to learn that the Cahto were neighbors rather than enemies, and Lone Wolf, the stoic warchief who had captured a white woman gathering plants near his territory, became Julia's closest friend and eventually something more. Not a romance that followed conventional patterns, but a deep partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the knowledge that some bonds transcend every boundary society tries to impose. Years later, when Julia was old and Grandmother Willow had passed peacefully into the spirit world, when Little Fawn had become a renowned healer in her own right, treating patients from both indigenous and settler communities, when the tensions between Cahto and white people had eased into something resembling genuine peace, Julia would look back on that summer of 1873 as the turning point of her life. She had been captured by fear, held by suspicion, and freed by the simple act of protecting a blind child from men who would have harmed her. In that moment, when she stood between Little Fawn and death, when Lone Wolf dropped his bow in recognition of her courage, everything changed. Not just for her, but for two communities that learned through her example that healing and compassion could build bridges strong enough to span any divide. And on quiet evenings when Julia sat with Little Fawn, now grown and with children of her own, teaching the next generation of healers from both cultures, she would touch the bare claw that still hung around her neck after all these years, and remember the terror of being captured, the joy of watching sight return to a child's eyes, the profound satisfaction of finding her truest purpose, not in the place she was born but in the place where her skills were most needed and her courage most fully realized. Some journeys, she reflected, begin with capture and end with freedom. But the deepest journeys, the ones that transform not just individuals but entire communities, begin the moment we choose to see the humanity in those we were taught to fear, and end only when that vision spreads like light breaking through darkness, illuminating paths forward that none could have imagined before one woman stood between a blind child and death, and changed everything. 1 year later, autumn 1874, the valley had transformed with the changing season. The redwoods standing sentinel over a landscape painted in gold and crimson. Julia Mackenzie stood at the edge of the Cahto village, watching as children played in the meadow below, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. Among them ran Little Fawn, now 9 years old, her long black hair streaming behind her as she chased after the other children with perfect vision and boundless energy. It was hard to believe only a year had passed since Julia had first been brought to this village as a captive, terrified and uncertain of her fate. So much had changed in those 12 months, not just for her but for both communities that had once viewed each other only through the lens of fear and suspicion. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention. Lone Wolf emerged from the tree line, carrying fresh game from the morning hunt. His face, once so guarded and stern when she first met him, now relaxed into an easy smile when he saw her. They had grown close over the past year, their relationship evolving from warchief and healer into something deeper. Though they both understood the complications that came with belonging to two different worlds. Dr. Adams sends word that he will visit next week, Julia said as Lone Wolf joined her. He wants to observe the treatments grandmother Willow and I have developed for the lung sickness affecting both our communities. 3 families in the settlement have recovered using our combined methods. Lone Wolf nodded with satisfaction. And the Council of Elders has agreed to allow more white healers to learn from grandmother Willow, if they come with respect and open minds. This would have been impossible a year ago. Your courage opened doors that seemed permanently closed. Little Fawn spotted them and came running up the hill, not a trace of the blind, stumbling child she had been remaining in her confident stride. She carried a basket filled with medicinal plants she had gathered under grandmother Willow's supervision. Already learning the healer's path she had chosen for her future. "Julia, look what I found," Little Fawn exclaimed, pulling out a cluster of rare mountain flowers. "Grandmother says these only bloom in autumn, and they are perfect for treating the fever that comes with the changing seasons. She is teaching me to prepare them properly." Julia examined the flowers with genuine interest, proud of how quickly her young student was learning. "You have a natural gift for this work, Little Fawn. Your mother would be very proud of the healer you are becoming." The child beamed at this praise, then threw her arms around Julia in an impulsive hug. "I can do this because you gave me back my sight. I will never forget that you risked everything to help me, even when I was a stranger and you were afraid." As evening settled over the valley and cooking fires began to glow throughout the village, Julia sat with Lone Wolf and Little Fawn outside their lodge, sharing a meal and stories of the day. Grandmother Willow joined them, her weathered face creased with contentment as she watched her adopted white daughter fitting so seamlessly into Cahto life. In the distance, Julia could see the lights of Redwood Creek settlement twinkling in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow she would ride there to spend 3 days treating patients and teaching Dr. Adams new techniques. Then she would return here, to the village that had become her true home, to continue building bridges between worlds that had once seemed impossibly divided. Lieutenant Wilson was long gone, transferred to a distant fort where his hatred could do less damage. In his place had come reasonable men willing to see the Cahto as people rather than obstacles to expansion. Peace, fragile but real, had taken root in this valley, nurtured by the simple act of one woman choosing compassion over fear. As stars emerged overhead and Little Fawn drifted to sleep against Julia's shoulder, her eyes closed but no longer trapped in permanent darkness, Julia reflected on the strange path that had led her here. She had come to California running from grief, seeking purpose in a harsh frontier. She had found both in the most unexpected way, captured by those she was taught to fear, and freed by the realization that healing knew no boundaries. The bear claw still hung around her neck, warm against her skin. Bright Morning's medicine box sat in her lodge, filled with tools that served both communities. And in her heart lived the profound certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, walking between two worlds and proving that the space between them could be filled not with conflict but with understanding, not with hatred but with hope.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.